intending to smash in one single blow America's resolution and its inability to retaliate. They failed miserably on both counts. The Japanese sank or badly damaged 7 antiquated American battleships, but since they were lost in harbor, many of their crews were saved, and all but 2 of the ships were salvaged. The raid also left most of Pearl Harbor's shore installations intact. Most important of all, the violation of United States territory united the nation behind the declaration of war on Japan. Moreover, the loss of the battleships forced the United States Navy to use its aircraft carriers as the core of a more up-to-date Pacific fleet.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The 1927 vintage Lexington and Saratoga and the much more modern Enterprise were out of port during the raid and were therefore untouched. By 1942, they were joined by the Enterprise's sister ship, Yorktown, and the newly completed Hornet. These carriers were well fitted to take the offensive, for they carried a large number of effective fighters and dive bombers. The Commander-in-Chief of the Central Pacific Fleet in 1942 was Admiral Chester William Nimitz. Within weeks of his appointment, this great leader transformed the morale of his men, infecting them all with his own confidence in a final Allied victory. Following his appointment, Nimitz decided to mount a series of raids on Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. The main reason for these raids, apart from harassing the Japanese, was to maintain the morale of his crews and give them valuable operational experience. On separate occasions, his fleet attacked Japanese bases in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Then, in March, he took his fleet to attack Wake and Marcus Islands. These strikes were by no means small, and the damage inflicted on all targets throughout the first few months of 1942 was considerable. One nightmare of pre-war Japanese military strategists had been the possibility of an attack by aircraft from the United States carriers on Japan's home islands. Their worst fears were fulfilled when, on the 18th of April 1942, 16 United States Army B-25 Mitchells struck Tokyo. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. What was even more surprising was the fact that these 12-ton aircraft, normally land-based, took off from the decks of the United States carrier Hornet. The very heart of Tokyo was bombed, and although the damage was slight, the effect on the Japanese nation was enormous. The horror of the Japanese people led to the commander of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, being granted permission for his grand plan. A final showdown between the United States and Japanese fleets. What Yamamoto did not include in his grand plan, however, was the fact that these plans would soon be known by his enemies. By the end of April, American intelligence were able to decrypt 85% of Japanese signals. This alone would give the Americans an incalculable advantage in the Pacific. Intelligence had been coming in, indicating a major offensive was being planned in the Southwest Pacific. The United States decoders confirmed that Port Moresby was the target along with a secondary target on the Solomon Islands. From these two strongholds, the Japanese could dominate, if not actually invade, northern Australia. The Japanese plan was to isolate Australia from the United States of America, first by seizing Port Moresby and establishing a seaplane base at the tiny island of Tulagi in the Solomons. Then they would take key points in New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, and Fiji. To mount this offensive, the Japanese had assembled an invasion force, which included a formidable striking force of 6 modern destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers, and the large fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku.
The revived flight will arrive in 20.
These carriers held 133 aircraft. The main Port Moresby invasion force was to depart from Rabaul, but the striking force was to come from Truk in the Caroline Islands, about 1,600 kilometers northeast of New Guinea.
Ready for upgrade.
The Americans acted quickly, and the hunt was on. Admiral Nimitz ordered a 3-part naval force to the Coral Sea. In tactical command of the whole force was Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher on the carrier Yorktown, which was to lead Task Force 17. On the 1st of May, this force linked up with Task Force 11, commanded by Rear Admiral Fitch on the carrier Lexington, just south of the Solomon Islands. The 2 carriers, carrying 141 aircraft, were escorted by 5 cruisers and 11 destroyers. This force was joined later in the day by an Australian-American force of cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral John Chris. On the 3rd of May, the Japanese seized the tiny island of Tulagi without meeting any opposition. The next day, they were struck by aircraft from the Yorktown. This American strike sunk a destroyer and several minor Japanese ships, but cost the Americans the advantage of surprise. The Japanese now knew that at least one United States carrier was in the vicinity. Throughout the 5th and 6th of May, the Japanese and American spotter planes sought each other out, but in vain.
Aircraft is delivered.
It was on the 7th of May that the 2 enemies eventually made contact, but both sides suffered equally from errors and accidents. Just after 0700 hours, a Japanese search plane spotted what he took to be an enemy carrier and cruiser southwest of Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Hara, in immediate command of the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, launched a full-scale attack. 51 dive bombers escorted by 18 Zero fighters took off for the offensive. The 2 ships spotted, however, were in fact the tanker USS Neosho and an escorting destroyer. They were easy targets. However, whilst this attack was underway, news reached Rear Admiral Hara that the real United States force had been spotted farther away to the northwest. All he could do was wait anxiously for his aircraft to return. But it wasn't only the Japanese that made a mistake. At 08:15 hours, a United States reconnaissance plane reported seeing 2 Japanese carriers and 4 large cruisers just north of Missima Island near the tip of New Guinea. Admiral Fletcher on the Yorktown, convinced that he had found the main Japanese force, launched his full-scale attack. 93 aircraft took off from the carriers Yorktown and Lexington. In fact, the reconnaissance pilot had only spotted one of the Japanese support groups, 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers. The day was saved by the sharp eyes of Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton, commander of the Lexington's dive bomber squadron. While on the way to attack the support group, Hamilton drifted off course to the east. He spotted a much more important force. A covering force for the Port Moresby invasion commanded by Rear Admiral Arimoto Goto on the carrier Shogo. The American planes were redirected. At first, the highly maneuverable Japanese carrier managed to dodge the American attacks, but Shogo was eventually overwhelmed and sunk. Meanwhile, Fletcher had directed the Australian-American force under Rear Admiral Crace against the Port Moresby invasion group. Crace's force was attacked by land-based Japanese aircraft from Rabaul and later by United States B-26s from Australia, mistaking them for Japanese. Luckily, neither attack was successful. Another amazing mistake on the part of the Japanese took place on the 7th of May. 27 Japanese aircraft out looking for the United States fleet spotted Yorktown. They mistook it for a Japanese carrier and attempted to land. 10 were shot down.
The revived flight will arrive in 1 minute.
News of the loss of Shogo and the presence of a United States-Australian force off Port Moresby persuaded the commander of the invasion force, Vice Admiral Inoue, to delay the attack on Port Moresby. First, he would deal with the United States carrier fleet. Early on the morning of the 8th, the two carrier forces finally located each other. After the loss of Shogo, both sides now had 2 carriers each, but the Japanese only had 95 operational aircraft against the Americans' 118. Shortly after 0900 hours, both sides' aircraft were launched and the Battle of the Coral Sea commenced. The Japanese attack inflicted significant damage on both Yorktown and Lexington. Yorktown managed, with clever maneuvering, to avoid the Japanese torpedoes, but bombs exploding in the water nearby badly damaged her below the waterline. Another bomb went down through 4 decks, where consequently it exploded, killing 37 of her crew and wounding 33. The Lexington, bigger and less maneuverable than the Yorktown, was hit by 2 torpedoes as well as several bombs and was listing badly on the port side. Meanwhile, United States pilots were launching an assault on the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Suikaku. Suikaku, the flagship, was hidden by a rainstorm, so the full weight of the American attack fell on the sister ship, Shokaku. The few defending Zeros were able to force the first wave of American devastators to launch their torpedoes too far away to make any hits. But the second wave of dauntless dive bombers that followed were much more successful. One dauntless pilot, Lieutenant John Powers, had vowed to sink an enemy carrier unaided. During the attack on Shokaku, he swooped in a daring low-level attack, releasing his bomb a mere 19 meters above the carrier's deck. In the resulting explosion, Powers crashed to his death in the sea. But the damage to the flight deck, caused as a result of his bomb, was so severe that the carrier's aircraft were no longer able to take off or land.
The last revived flight will arrive.
Further bombs completed the job. Shokaku had to withdraw from the battle. No longer with air cover, Inouye had to call off the whole operation and withdraw his invasion force. The Battle of the Coral Sea was thus a strategic success for the Americans, but it was marred by a serious and unexpected incident. 2 hours after the last plane had retired from the battle, Lexington erupted in a huge explosion. Ironically, this was nothing to do with the attack, but was caused by a mere spark from a generator, which had accidentally been left running. The fires were fed by petrol fuel and vapor from the ruptured tanks. It took until the next day to put the fire out, but by then the damage was so severe that she had to be abandoned. 2,735 crew were saved, but 216 had died in the fire. She was sunk by a torpedo fired from an American destroyer. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, a tanker, and a destroyer, while the Japanese lost 1 carrier and 1 destroyer. But only 564 United States sailors and airmen had been killed, compared to Japanese losses of 1,074 men. Japan also lost 77 aircraft, compared to America's 66. The battle turned back the Japanese threat to Port Moresby and consequently to Australia. The Coral Sea had been the first sea battle ever where 2 fleets had engaged on the high seas without being in sight of one another and relying entirely upon aircraft to strike the enemy. The Americans were quick to master this new type of naval warfare and were ready to use it again at a later date. That date was not far away. Japan's admirals were already planning another battle where they hoped to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet once and for all. By attacking Midway Atoll, at the far western end of the Hawaiian chain of islands, the Japanese hoped to lure the United States Pacific Fleet into the open sea and destroy it. On the 20th of May 1942, Allied listening stations around the Pacific picked up a lengthy radio signal in code from Admiral Yamamoto to his fleet. The message was relayed to the United States Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor and deciphered. It was revealed that the Japanese Navy was about to mount a powerful attack on the mid-Pacific atoll of Midway with a secondary diversionary attack